I'm Jesse Ventura. Stay vigilant and question more. Welcome to my world. Come along for the ride. The world according to Jesse. The private sector may soon replace governments as the dominant leader of the space industry. But what are the pros and cons of space capitalism? Today, we talk about all of that and more. Sit tight. The show starts now. The world according to Jesse.
The Trump administration plans to withdraw federal funding for NASA's International Space Station by 2025 and turn the keys over to the private sector. Maintenance costs, which run the government over $3 billion per year, is the reason cited. Meanwhile, the administration is shifting its focus and asking Congress to approve $8 billion to increase space security systems. For 18 years, the International Space Station has been a beacon of international cooperation and peace between governments. Jesse, what do you think about shifting the focus from space exploration to security?
I think it's horrible. The one thing that we on this planet should be working together is not to bring our hostilities into space. And let's have some fun with it right now. We're going out there, and the president has said and all this that we're going to create a space military force and all that. You know what? It's time to go back to 1951 when a great movie came out called The Day the Earth Stood Still. I think it's time for Gort to visit us now, to put us in line so that we don't carry our trivial fights out into space. How many people remember the original The Day the Earth Stood Still and Gort, that big guy that the beam come out of? Well, we need to go back to that before we go out to space, because I'll be damned if we should take our hostilities into space. And I want to know something else. What is this entity that they always tell us is trying to take over the United States? Who is this? Who is this entity that's trying to do that? Is it the Russians? Is it the Chinese? Is it somebody else? They make us feel like everybody out there is trying to take us over, and that there's an enemy behind every tree.
This June, President Trump ordered officials to create a new Space Force. Congress has yet to approve of it, but Vice President Mike Pence says it could be operational as soon as 2020, stating, quote, "The time has come to write the next great chapter in the history of our armed forces, to prepare for the next battlefield where America's best and bravest will be called to deter and defeat a new generation of threats to our people and to our nation." He also said it's not enough to have an American presence in space. He wants American dominance in space. If created, the Space Force will be the sixth branch of American armed forces. Jesse, the 1967 internationally recognized Outer Space Treaty says governments can only use space for peaceful purposes, and that no one can claim space for or its celestial bodies for itself, because space is the province of all mankind. Do these actions and statements from the administration align with the rules of that treaty when you hear them?
No, absolutely not. They don't align with it. What they're saying is they don't want military and war to go into space. But of course, what Mike Pence is saying, we want to get up there, dominate space, and control it all for us, because all these people are out to get us. Mike Pence, please tell me who's out to take over the United States. Is it the Russians? Is it the Chinese? Or is it the Martians? Who is it that wants to take over the United States of America so that we have to continually spend our money on useless things for the war machine, which are now going to take into space? I'll finish with this. Where is Gort when you need him?
In August, the U.S. rejected a draft treaty proposed by China and Russia aimed at preventing an arms race in space. The proposal, first submitted in 2008, seeks to ban all weapons beyond Earth. Currently, the Outer Space Treaty only bans nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction in space. The U.S. has consistently rejected the proposal, this time calling it hypocritical over Russia's suspected development of anti-satellite weapons. China, Russia, and the United States are all reportedly developing or already in possession of space weapons. Now, each country points to the suspected capabilities of the other to justify the need for its own arsenal. Would a treaty like this really even solve the issue of weapons in space? I mean, who's going to enforce it, Jesse?
Well, that's the point. You know, they're sitting here and all they want to do is take the world to war. That's what the United States is now. Let's face it, we are a war economy. We have to be at war all the time, and now they're looking for outer space to be the next means of war. I'll tell you what, it's never going to get to space war in outer space, in my opinion, because I believe we will kill each other down here before the war ever extends to out there. How's that?
When President Lyndon Johnson signed the Outer Space Treaty, he said, quote, "It means that astronaut and cosmonaut will meet someday on the surface of the moon as brothers and not as warriors for competing nationalities or ideologies." Now, if the international governments stop getting along in space, could privatizing the industry pose a possible solution and bring people together regardless of their nationality?
That's a possibility because money talks, and we all know BS walks. So can capitalism and privatization help save the war in space that seems to be brewing? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know.
For the first time in history, private companies and individuals are democratizing access to space exploration and the universe. Soon, the private sector may even replace nation-states as the dominant industry leader. Rather than waiting for NASA or other government agencies to put humans on Mars, etc., private entities are working on their own plans to make space dreams a reality. The private sector is already making payloads more affordable, and it may soon make the industry profitable even. Capitalism, the root of many problems here on Earth, may actually save exploration in space and innovation, but we'll have to see. Do you think it's good that governments are no longer the only pioneers in space, Jesse?
I don't know. You know, that remains to be seen. You know, the soup's got to be made. The stew's got to be made to find out. Will the private sector do a better job up in space than government? I'm certain they can do it economically better, which is a good thing, because they're going to look at the money. You know, you got to remember, governments have unlimited amounts of money. They can blow lots of money on needless stuff, where the private sector isn't afforded that luxury. So it will become cheaper. That's good. But what happens if the private companies go after each other out in space in competition? Could it end up war? I don't know. Maybe our next guest later on this hour can help clear that up for us.
The laws that govern and regulate space capitalism are minimal, Jesse. We've been given an opportunity to start fresh when it comes to democratizing space, but in April, the House unanimously passed a bill granting U.S. citizens and entities freedom to explore and use space and its resources without conditions or limitations. Respond to this.
Well, you know, first of all, there's a danger in that all the time, because whenever the government turns things over without any regulations, well, then they could run amok, you know, without anyone overseeing, just like what happened on Wall Street. When you don't regulate Wall Street runs amok and the entire economy goes down the toilet. That's what you got to worry about.
Right. It's time for a break. When we return, Jesse sits down with a special guest for more about privatizing space.
The world according to Jesse.
I'm Larry King. Questioning, listening, learning. You know, I've always said I never learned anything when I was talking. It's important to listen. Question more.
RT America brings you stories of worldwide significance, news the corporate media refuses to show you. From social movements to civil wars to tech breakthroughs to epidemics, because our journalists and audience alike dare to question more.
Our culture is awash in lies, dominated by streams of never-ending electronic hallucinations that merge fact and fiction until they are indistinguishable. We have become the most illusioned society on earth. Politics is a species of endless and meaningless political theater. Politicians have morphed into celebrities. Our two ruling parties are in reality one party, the corporate party. And those who attempt to puncture this vast, breathless universe of fake news designed to push through the cruelty and exploitation of the neoliberal order are pushed so far to the margins of society, including by a public broadcasting system that has sold its soul for corporate money, that we might as well be mice squeaking against an avalanche. But squeak we must.
I'm Jesse Ventura. Stay vigilant and question more. Welcome to my world. Come along for the ride. The world according to Jesse. Today we're going to talk about space. And you know, I got a big background in space. When I was young, before I went in the Navy, I used to watch Star Trek all the time. But today, Jim Cantrell is back on the show to talk with me more about space. Now, Jim was on the founding teams of SpaceX and Moon Express. He's now the CEO of Vector, a private spaceflight company working to mass produce rockets. Jim joins me now from Arizona. Jim, it's great to have you back. Wait a minute now. How do private space companies like yours differ from government-funded space programs like NASA?
Well, we don't get our money from the government. We get our money from private companies and private individuals, and we like to think that we're a lot more productive than what the government does. We tend to produce our goods and services for probably about a tenth the cost of what the government does, just primarily because of the way the government buys and the way that the government sees the risk play out.
Okay, so really you're more efficient. The government has red tape and it's more difficult, I guess, going through the loopholes of being government. Now, the Trump administration wants to stop funding the International Space Station by 2025 and turn operations over to the private sector. In your opinion, is this a good idea, and what are the pros and cons?
Well, in general, I'm behind these sort of things. The space station, however, was built by the government and international partners, so it's a complicated transaction. But let me remind you that when the space shuttle was retired under Administrator Griffin, he made a bet, and he called it the commercial orbital transportation system, where he went out to a number of companies like SpaceX, Orbital Sciences, and said, hey, to get goods and services to the space station, why don't we give a chance to these budding commercial companies? And that's really what brought SpaceX along to where it is today. And it was probably, arguably, something that saved NASA, who has not been able to build a rocket ever since. So in general, I think it's a good idea that the government gets out of the business of doing things that they are not necessarily competitive with private industry doing. What their real role, in my opinion, should be is on the leading edge of science and technology, where it doesn't really have a commercial application in the near term.
Okay, now critics say it's impossible for a private space company to profit because it won't be able to accept large government subsidies, which have greatly funded space exploration so far. There's now concern that private military contractors will fill that funding vacuum in militarized space. How can we keep private space companies in the hands of people who will follow the laws of the Outer Space Treaty?
Well, so there's really two flavors of private space companies. You allude to those who have been traditionally a part of the military space complex and what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. So, you know, they're the brand names I don't have to mention, the big companies that make most of their money on public contracts and so forth. Then there's the commercial companies that are purely commercial in nature, like Vector, for example. None of us hold security clearances within the company, and we're there. We will sell to the military, we will sell to NASA, but we're not there primarily as a vendor to those organizations, and we're primarily commercial. So in the sense, commercial companies like us, we don't want to break the laws. We want to be around in the future to enjoy a peaceful world where we can actually make money and advance humanity. So I think there's sort of an inherent self-interest we have when we're commercial to not do this. and not to be mixed up really with sort of the military contractors, which I've gone on record of calling this a Soviet industrial complex, where the military sets a 5-year goal and procures things just like the Soviet Union used to do. And that's more of a sort of a buddy capitalist system than it is a real capitalist system.
Well, I hope the upside wins out on this, because I'd hate for the, it just chills me to think that, war in space, man, can't the planet get together on just that thing alone and not do it? Right now, there's talk that Elon Musk may take Tesla private with funding from the government of Saudi Arabia. Could he also fund SpaceX with funding from a foreign government? If yes, how is this a separation of nation states and private companies? What problems could arise from that?
Yeah, SpaceX is a purely private corporation. I don't know who all of their shareholders are, and there's nothing in the law that prevents them from taking money from foreign corporations. There is something called CFIUS, which is the Committee on the Financial Investment in the United States. And there are some rules that the Trump administration is tightening up on that to prevent these kind of scenarios, what you're talking about there. But the reality is there's no real good policing mechanism for that. If you're a small government kind of person, you really don't want to see those sort of things where the government has the powers to come in and tell you who you can and cannot take investment from. So it's a two-edged sword is kind of what the problem is. And you hate to just leave it to the good hearts of men and women to do the right thing. But in the reality is that's kind of where it comes down to, is that the profit motive tends to not be a motive that wants you to start a war in space, unless, of course, you are one of the military contractors that benefits from this. So I think that war in space is actually in nobody's interest, really, in the end, because it creates a debris field that lasts for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's somewhat the equivalent of nuclear war here on the surface of the Earth, that the entire planet gets to pay the price for the exchange. The same happens in space with debris. So those of us in the private space industry really don't want to see that happen. And we're putting our lives and our hard-earned money and our time into these enterprises. And the last thing we want to see is have them destroyed by a foreign investor that is not aligned with our interests. So there's not really a good answer to your question, Jesse. It's just one of those things that's an outside risk that comes with capitalism, I think.
Yeah. Okay. What projects are private space companies working on that you're excited about right now? And what are you working on right now?
So there's two areas I'm really excited about in private space. One of them is cryptocurrency in space, and we just signed a launch contract with a company called Nexus, which is a cryptocurrency, where they're going to start storing and moving around cryptocurrency in orbit as part of their overall blockchain distribution plans. And I think that blockchain has a future to tokenize networks like that and eventually bring information access to the entire world and value transportation to the entire world, even the deserts of Africa, where you have sparse populations and no infrastructure. So to me, that's a terribly exciting thing, and we're happy to be associated with them on the early days. There's other interesting technologies. We all debate and argue about climate and whether or not man's influence on the climate is detrimental or how bad it is. There's a company called Planet IQ that we just signed up for a launch that's using GPS signals to get a real-time 24/7 measurement of what's going on in the atmosphere from top to bottom that will revolutionize the way weather is forecast, and our view of climate in the long run will benefit because we'll better understand the Earth. So that's terribly exciting. And then on our side at Vector, we're working on small launch vehicles that'll take all of these small satellites to space. And really, we think of ourselves as the Henry Fords of the 21st century by creating small rockets that the average companies can afford, and that even will revolutionize the way people can access space. We've taken the cost of a launch vehicle down from $100 million to $1 million, and in so doing, we think we'll change the world with it.
Very good. Now, space is one arena that governments across the globe have worked together on, including the United States and Russia. How do you think billionaires and private money will affect international cooperation in space?
And I think this is actually the new cooperation in space. You know, we have two very high profile billionaires right now playing around in it. That's Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. And both of those efforts came from the early efforts I was involved with Elon. And I see that as part of the future of space activities, particularly on the commercial side, where you have one individual funding it. But there's the other side that's very interesting. There's been upwards of $2 billion a year in investment into the commercial space industry that's coming in the last 4 or 5 years. And those are also, if you think about it, coming from funds that are funded by billionaires, arm's length kinds of transactions, and not individuals who come in and shape it to their own vision. I see that as becoming really the norm for the next 10 or 20 years. If you listen to Morgan Stanley, for example, they're forecasting a $2 trillion space economy within the next 7 years, which is a fourfold increase over what it is today. And I think space cooperation in terms of sending humans will become something of a private nature. And the governments simply don't have the money to send humans to Mars, to send humans to the moon. And I think that you'll see that private industry is the one that can actually garner the resources, number one, and number two, take the kinds of risks and get the kind of efficiency that actually makes that happen. So I think it's a bright future, and I'm looking forward to it.
Now, what do you think will ultimately happen to NASA and other government space agencies as private companies continue developing a strong space presence? Do you think they'll just simply go out of business?
No, I don't think so. There's always an imperative to have a space agency in a nation, and they become more users of the services than they are developers of the services. When NASA first came into being, it was to respond to the challenge of the Soviet Union and Sputnik, and we really didn't have good launch vehicles. We had some that were ICBMs to deliver nuclear weapons. So part of NASA's reason to be was to convert those over and launch astronauts. Then that really crescendoed in the first mission to the moon, where Neil Armstrong stepped off. So that's actually the nation-state space that is fading into the background, where they develop all those technologies, and arguably the public and the commercial sectors benefited from that technology developed in the United States. But if you look where we are today, space is still one of those things that Americans do very, very well, probably is better than anybody else in the world, and the commercial industry is taking that forward. NASA will always continue to be a net user of that for science, for exploration, for those sort of things that, again, have no real commercial purpose. And I would argue that sending humans to Mars, even for commercial people, satisfies this desire in us to see what's around the next corner. But that's also what NASA does. They send probes to Jupiter, they send probes to Mars, they send probes to places that we'll never see with a human. And that's something that doesn't have an economic return, but it has a great return on the human spirit and gives us another dimension to our life that, frankly, I think is very worthwhile. And if you look around at the world space agencies, they're in many ways followers to NASA, and I see them following the same model. As we continue to commercialize the space infrastructure, all of these space agencies will become users of the commercial infrastructure.
Okay, now, the last time we spoke, we discussed your son Cullen's project to create a decentralized internet. It seems we need it now more than ever because of the rising censorship. How is that project coming along?
Yeah, he's doing well. I spoke with him yesterday, and they have now a 3-dimensional blockchain that they're developing, and the Nexus satellite network is what he's starting with, that we're going to be launching into space, WeVector. And that's coming along. I think that this issue of censorship is the great issue of our time that people don't take as seriously as they need to. You know, there's censorship in the news media, there's censorship on the technical platforms, the social media platforms. Hell, there's censorship in the universities. You know, you're not allowed to say certain things. And that's one of the great, I think, things that has made this country so wonderful is our freedom of speech. And I'm looking forward to the day when we can be able to talk around all of these various forms of censorship, like in China, for example, the great firewall of China, and they're not able to look up certain websites there. We have the same effect happening with Google. There always has to be a counter to anybody who's somehow managed to amass power and fortune and influence, and thereby wants to control free speech. And so hopefully, as blockchain allows or frees people from governments controlling their monetary resources, hopefully blockchain can do the same thing for free speech. And I'm all behind this, and I think it's going to achieve great things.
Great. Jim, thanks for coming on. We love to get you back again as things progress. Have a great day, and again, thank you for coming on The World According to Jesse.
Thank you, Jesse.
The World According to Jesse.
It's time to turn to the viewers. We asked people on social media, should there be government oversight on private companies looking to commercialize space? Why or why not? Daryl says no. In a truly free market, private companies are entirely beholden to the will of the market. As soon as you inject government regulations or oversight, you introduced a corrupting element where corporatists use government power to rig the market in their favor. Jesse?
Well, that's true, but without any type of overseeing, they can rig the markets in their favor also. So if you're looking for pure, unadulterated capitalism, then have at it. But then you'll also get the results of that unadulterated capitalism. As I said earlier, you saw when they lifted off the shackles on Wall Street, what the ultimate result was to uninhibited capitalism. They lied and destroyed our entire economy. You have to have a balance, a check and a balance between capitalism and socialism for government to work and society to work correctly.
Richmond says there's government oversight over roads, so why not in space? But he also says we should restrict oversight to the bare minimum.
I agree, but I think I agree with him that there should be some type of oversight, that we need to have some type of control of what goes on out there. It can't just be freewheeling the Wild West with everybody running around with a gun on their hip shooting at everybody else in outer space. We don't want the Wild West revisited out there. I don't think so.
All right, that's our show. Thanks for watching. Send us your comments on social media for a chance to be featured in next week's brand new episode.
And remember, when the government lies, the truth, yes, the truth, becomes a traitor. Stay vigilant. The World According to Jesse.